these mussel banks, and those mussel banks decreased in aerial extent. And we had lost this natural system of mussel banks, so restoration efforts were aimed to return these mussel banks. And what was done a lot, for example, is spreading out shell material, also spat on shell material to regain these mussel banks, but nothing actually really worked. We had a lot of problems with predation from shrimps. So it looked good, but then with high tides, the shrimps came and they mostly eat all these young mussels because there was not any protections on these tidal flats. Moreover, the sediment was moving around quite a lot, so the mussels were not able to keep in place, and a lot of the young mussels died just because movement or burying by sediment. So we needed something else that actually could restore mussel banks in an effective manner. And because the Walensee is a World Heritage Site, with all our restoration efforts, we were not allowed to use plastic or concrete or anything permanent. That was from the beginning onwards. They said to us, if you want to do any research projects in this area, it has to be biodegradable or from a natural source. So that straight away set our goal of our projects to restore these mussel banks in a sort of a manner that we had to look for materials that were biodegradable. And our design, or what we were thinking about, we designed this together with scientists in the Netherlands, is that because we've lost these natural mussel banks, is that young mussels have problem with settling, that we actually want to regain these adult mussel banks or mimic adult mussel banks so that young mussel larvae floating in the water can find a safe haven within this mimicking mussel bank and can grow and outgrow the structure, and then the structure can degrade. So we were looking for a structure that actually looks like a mussel bank. Yeah. And what we came up was like designing a really complex 3D structure, because that's actually what a mussel bank in theory is, like a really complex 3D structure where these small larvae find a space to hide in and outgrow the structure. And this was the structure we designed in the first phase. So that's a BESE elements. And because it needed to be biodegradable, we designed it straight away from starch, from potato chips. It's a waste product that we use right now in all kind of ecosystems. I will tell you more about the function of that later, how it works. But it's biodegradable, so it's made of potato starch that is leftover products from the chips industry in the Netherlands. The leftover side waste is being collected and being transformed into a biopolymer that's actually marine and aquatic, also freshwater degradable. And we design it in a way that it's sort of Lego blocks, so we can stack them in any height we want and also in any length we want to create larger surface areas or just smaller blocks. Yeah, it's really in that way easy to use. So here you see them in the Walensee. This was the first pilot we did with them. When we finally got the material, we placed them out in the Walensee like this. To see if we could catch any mussels within our structures. And this was after 6 months. So our structure was literally crammed with mussels. And the theory, the scientists designed that these young mussels need some kind of mimicking mussel bank to actually survive and grow, was true. And we got amazing results with this complex 3D structure that just mimics an adult mussel bank. And after 1 year, you see the structure losing its mechanical properties, and actually the mussel banks are just taking over the BESE elements. And for mussel banks, same of course is for oyster larvae that like to settle upon the structure. Yeah. And what the structure does, it provides them substrate, and within the structure, the wave energy is a lot lower. Flow rate is decreased a lot within the structure, so they find sort of a safe haven to grow in. All the predation pressure is a lot lower within the structure, which just gives them the right habitat conditions to grow and flourish. And this was our first, like you just saw the mussel banks with these elements, and this is the first oyster reef with these elements. So this is in Florida, Cedar Key, where we did the first oyster reef trials with these elements, just to see if it actually worked in the same way as it did with mussel banks in the Netherlands. And it did. So we got a fully overgrown bees element here. You just see a little bit of the structure in here with oysters. And it's like a principle we just replicated in different coastal ecosystems that actually face the same problem. So if you have lost the adult ecosystems, it's really hard for young plants or animals to regain their position within these tidal ecosystems. So if you just give them the protection in that first stage of life that mimics the adult ecosystem that was once present, then you can just give them a better chance of survival in these dynamic ecosystems. So we've used this principle for seagrass restoration, salt marsh restoration, mangroves, what I just told you, riverbank vegetation, submerged aquatic vegetation, a lot of different types of ecosystems. And all together with scientists to actually study the way the material works in all these ecosystems and what the results would be in different ecosystems and also in different climate zones. And the main work is done by researchers in the Netherlands and researchers in Florida from the University of Florida. There was a really strong collaboration where we've looked into the way how we could enhance salt marsh and seagrass growth with the BESE elements. And what we did is we mimicked the stem and root biomass of a spartina or seagrass pluck on a tidal flat to see if the BESE element could actually function in a manner a full-grown spartina pluck would do on a tidal flat. So this is how the setup looked in the beginning. So what we did is that this is a spartina salt marsh plant that we placed in the middle of the BESE elements. And because the BESE element stabilizes the sediment and reduces flow rate, this plant is able to survive on a spot where it wouldn't survive if you would just plant it without any protection. And if you would look after 6 months, this is the same plot, how it looks. So you give this salt marsh spartina plant like a protection against wave, against currents, and then it finds a suitable place to outgrow. And also pioneering species you see within here, like Salicornia, is able to actually sprout within the BESE elements, like, yeah. So yeah, and this is the control plot where we also planted spartina, but they just got washed out because there's no protection present from these plants. And same is for seagrass restoration, where we have done exactly the same pilots also on a worldwide scale. You see here, all the little bees are the piloting spots where we did this for seagrass restoration. And again, we placed rhizomes of seagrass within the BESE elements to see if outgrowth was visible. And the same result as what we saw for salt marsh restoration was present in seagrass restoration. The only different thing that was present is that for salt marsh restoration, it's better to put the BESE elements on top of the sediment and mimic the stem system of spartina. While for seagrass restoration, it was better to actually dig in the BESE elements and mimic root systems of seagrasses and let the top part just flow freely in the water column. So still like tiny details are being researched. I'm not going into this because it's too long. You want to hear more about oyster reefs, so I have a lot more examples about oyster reefs and the research we have done in that area. I just already told you about I showed you the picture of the first pilot we did in Cedar Key with the oyster reefs. And here you see the setup of how this looked like. So you see the BESE elements placed on top of a tidal bar consisting out of shell hash. And the BESE elements were placed in different tidal heights to determine which tidal height was most suitable for oyster growth. And was just a stack of beads 8 layers thick placed on the tidal bar and monitored by the University of Florida. And this was after a year. The results when we came back in the middle tidal height, we saw almost fully grown oysters on them, quite colonized structures. The higher zone was not colonized at all, was just too high in the water column, but the middle and lower zone were colonized fully with oysters. Was a really good result for us and a way to go forward with this oyster research and the use of BESE elements for oyster reef restoration. And we did a lot of different pilots on different sites with BESE elements and oyster reef restoration, and the results you see here with these amazing pictures actually didn't happen on every site. And what we notice is that in Cedar Key, it's a site where we have a lot of shell hash material available and a lot of larvae in the water column, because it's also an area with an extensive aquaculture industry. So we had all the right factors in play. We only had to stabilize this shell hash bar. That's what the BESE element did. And then the larvae just came onto and grew out into adult oysters. But in areas where we just had a bare mud flat and we placed the BESE elements on top of that, we got like 0 to no oyster recruitment on the BESE elements. So the elements themselves do not function as a sediment cube for these oysters. You really need to add oysters or shell material or calcium carbonate sediment cube for them to the structure to aid them to actually settle upon the BESE elements, because they wouldn't do that normally themselves, or you have to just have conditions like Cedar Key with a lot of larvae and a lot of shell material around. So what we did is we trialed different things to add shell material to the BESE elements. So here you see a pilot where we actually made a hole within the BESE elements, placed the lid on top, so to add the sediment cube within the BESE elements. And a beneficial way of this is that often oyster or shell material is limited. So normally if you would just outplace a lot of shell material, you would need a lot of it to cover a lot of area. Well, if you place just a few shell within the BESE element itself creates a surface area and the sediment cube is within. So you need less shell material for your restoration efforts. And on the left, you see the picture of the results again. So we got really nice results just by adding shell in the middle of the BESE elements. And then other researchers started like trialing or be innovative with the material. One of these researchers is Linda Walters from the University of Central Florida, and she created these oyster mats. I don't know if you've heard about them, but she's really successful in restoring oyster reefs in the Indian River Lagoon in Florida by using these mats. And what she formerly used was actually plastic mats. So you see them on the right, a black plastic mesh with a tie wraps that connects the the oyster shells to the mat, and she places this out in the Indian River Lagoon, and oysters just settle upon it, and she creates these beautiful oyster bars. But the problem is it's all plastic. So, and this will remain in the area forever. So she was looking for an alternative, and she saw the BESE elements and she thought maybe this would help. So she actually used the BESE elements as a base for her oyster mats, which you see on the top left. And she used metal wire to attach the oyster shells to just really remove away from the plastic she used. And she got the same of even better results with these BESE elements. And she has a lot of volunteers that help her out with creating these oyster mats, because as you can see, it's quite labor intensive. She actually drills a hole in actually every single oyster and attaches them to a BESE element. So you need a lot of willing hands to help you out. It's nice work, but it's for a nice volunteering activity. Let me say that. And she placed them out in the field and got really great results. I can afterwards share the paper she wrote about it. Just the oysters were cramming the structures, and she got similar results as what she did in the previous plastic structures she made. So now she is actually making all the reefs she's making out of these BESE mats that she designed. And for us, this is a lot of handwork, a lot of volunteering, a lot of people you need to help you out with creating these reefs. which is really nice if you have the people. But often in cases where we work in the Netherlands, for example, we don't have a lot of volunteering people. So a lot of work is being done by ourselves, putting materials out in the fields. So we need an easy way to get this settlement queue of oysters within our BESE elements. So that gave us thinking, okay, how can we create an easy queue that's easy for us to apply to the BESE elements and still as effective as would be adding shell by hand to a BESE element. And we designed a sort of a paste. Well, we call it a Reef paste that is based just on grinded shell material. And it's maybe familiar or similar as you would see as concrete, but it's all biodegradable and bio-based. And you can just paste it on anything, and we also make tiles out of it. But the main thing we use it with is just adding a layer of calcium carbonate to the BESE elements. And this is also the oysters we restore in the Netherlands is Oyster species. So we actually use grinded shell material from the Oyster species to cover up the BESE elements, to create this small little coating layer that is enough to get larvae from settling or to get spat on our structures. So here you see the BESE elements that got the coating on them, and then the first spat that settled upon the BESE elements that had the coating on there. So yeah, and that's for us a much easier way to add that settlement queue to the BESE elements than single-handedly attaching shell to the material. And what we do right now with the paste as well, because it's not only applicable to BESE elements, we also use it, for example, in Netherlands, we've got a lot of this type of dikes with stones protecting the land behind it from high water and waves. But these stones themselves are often not the best settlement area for oysters or mussels. So what we're doing right now is also adding this material to stones on dike slopes to create a more favorable habitat for shellfish to grow on the intertidal areas on dike slopes. Yeah, which is a really nice project as well. So another use of this material, which is designed it for BESE elements, but now it's taking another flight on its own. Yeah, and how much time I have? I think I'm gonna go through with. Let me just see if I got so many examples. Yeah. I think I can leave it with this and then leave it with the end. So just so you know who we are, because I'm not the only person in this team. So we do this restoration work with a small team in the Netherlands, and we can do this work worldwide because we have just a network of universities and people like you that we work together with to set up all these pilot projects and to gather the information and the monitoring data people collect for us to like improve and design even better materials and products for these restoration efforts. So it looks like only 4 people, but actually if you see all the links we have around the globe, it's there should be a lot of other pictures of people where we work with in this photo. But this is the BESE team in the Netherlands with me, Karen, Wouter, and Laura doing the main work. Yeah. So just I think I'm gonna leave it with this, or else I'm gonna just talk for hours, and that's maybe not what you want.
Well, Malenthe, this has been great. It would be, could we open it up to questions at this point?
Yeah, definitely.
I have a couple of questions on the oyster project, which is the problem up here in the north, not Florida, but here in New York. The water freezes in the winter, and the oysters will be killed by being frozen often, and which is so we would have to do things further underwater. Can these BESE products survive below, below the high tide, below the low tide, on a muddy substrate?
Yeah, definitely. That's the same conditions we work in the Netherlands for oyster reef restoration.
That's what I wondered.
The oysters we want to restore in the Netherlands are actually only growing in the subtidal area
Mhm.
on the sandbars. So yeah, that's I haven't put a picture in, but that's the area we work with in the Netherlands as well. So the BESE elements are degradable. And you have to think about that if you put them in an intertidal area with a lot of sunlight, warmth, and active oxygenated soil, the degradation process goes a lot faster than if you place them in a subtidal area on the sandy bottom that hasn't have a lot of microbial activity. So that's the main difference in the property of the BESE element. They will actually last longer in subtidal conditions compared to intertidal conditions.
Thank you. That's great. What about when it's soft and mucky, and not sand, not rock, not solid, but something where the BESE product would probably, sink a bit into muck? Is that something that it can survive?
Yeah, yeah. We the salt marsh projects we do are often in areas where we are like knee deep in the mud.
Mhm.
And because the surface area you create, they are able to stay on top of the sediment. You would lose the, like you see the layering within. I don't know if you see it in this picture. No. But the BESE element has these layers, and often when we know that we're working in a really mucky area, that we use more layers because we know we're gonna lose two. You're gonna see it here. Like here you see the BESE elements from the start when we
Mhm.
set it up. So this is a 3-layered BESE elements. It's normally like 6 centimeters high. And after half a year, you see that all the layers have actually been buried within the sediment that you saw in the previous photo. Because the BESE element sort of entraps sediment in this case because the flow rate is reduced so much, but therefore it also creates the conditions for this Spartina to grow. And if we want to use this for oyster reef restoration, for example, you just should add another 3 layers to keep that substrate
Mhm.
above the seafloor or the tidal.
Yeah, great. Okay, interesting. I have at my own beach, I have a great deal of Spartina that's being supported by thousands, well, hundreds anyway, of mussels, and which survive perfectly well, of course, during the cold weather. And we tried to transplant some. We dug up the Spartina from one part of the beach and moved it with its mussels to the other side, but I don't think it functioned very well doing that. So this stuff would be terrific. I think that we could do some transplanting. And Sally, we also have the beach at the living shoreline too, where there's kind of that we would like to increase the use of and get mussels in there as well. We aren't the City Island Mussel Project, but
But it's exactly right. What Barbara's talking about, this living shoreline that we're working on, which is we've been funded for it. It's a sort of an educational center. It's part pilot oyster reef. There's also a patch of Spartina grass, which we would like to encourage more growth. So something like this would be very interesting. And then there's also a marshland area that's starting to, it's behind a riprap, sort of big rocks in the water, a sort of loose breakwater. And it's starting to degrade. It's breaking down in certain areas. So there are 3 issues going on environmentally that we'd like to address there. Back to the Spartina grass, this photograph that we're seeing, I see that you put pilings in to secure your BESE products. Do those pilings stay in permanently, and what are they made out of, and how far do they go down?
Yeah, in this case, it's wooden pilings that we use. And these ones are about, I think this was 80 centimeters, about 1 meter in length. I think that's 3 feet, about 3 feet.
Yeah.
And that's what we used in the first pilot, but actually what we use mostly right now is that what you see in here, that's rebar.
Okay.
So we use rebar pins also from 2 to 3 feet in length, depending on the location. The more dynamic you have it, the longer you go to fastening the structure to the sediment. And this is all when you have soft and sandy bottoms. If you don't have that, we use gravity-based foundation. So we use rocks that are in the system, present in the system, to anchor the bead down. Just depends on where you're working. But if you have a sandy substrate, yeah, this is the easiest way to put them in the field. But we have also had conditions, for example, in the Indian River Lagoon, they are not allowed to use rebar, so there they use wood. Again, it just depends on where you are. But if you are allowed to use rebar, I would definitely recommend using that.
It's very mucky, as Barbara had mentioned, the area where we're working with. Does the rebar work okay with a mucky area?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And ultimately, are you once the Spartina grass has taken hold and is growing, are you taking out the rebar? You're not leaving that, or are you leaving that there permanently?
For our projects right now, we can leave it there permanently. In itself, they are like, if you make them thick, they will degrade over a long period of time as well. So in the Netherlands, we are allowed to leave them in. But again, that depends on the permitting agency you're working with, if that's allowed or not. If some people see rebar as a biodegradable material that you can use in low amounts within these systems, but other managers of nature reserves don't see it in that manner, and they would like you to get them out or use wood instead. So it just depends on the system what we would use. But like, if you, for example, you see this picture here, like this is fully rooted bead element, so you see all the plots on the Spartina. This was in the back, you see the salt marsh, so we use transplant from the salt marsh here. We place them within the BESE elements to get these little islands of Spartina and to show the functionality of our BESE elements. And in this, like how densely it's rooted right now, yeah, you can pull the rebar out of that and it would be still happy standing there, no problem.
Heavy use is kind of going on the muddy bottom because we see that also, throughout Long Island in certain areas. Have you used any more, I guess the word is intrusive anchor methods? So let's say in a muddy bottom, if rebar isn't enough to hold it down, you might be able to use like a screw anchor, where you just kind of, go through the material, screw it down, but it's a little bit more intrusive to the material than a thin piece of rebar. I don't know if it might destroy it or not, but have you tried different anchoring methods?
Yeah, like for the muddy areas, rebar has always been enough for us. What we have done differently is another anchoring method. I can show you, I think here, but it's totally different. Yeah, on this picture on the right top, you see this. We created a subtitle Reef for BESE elements. This is Australia, Brisbane. I didn't tell you this story, but it's a subtitle Reef for oysters. This is also a really large. This is a 1 meter high block of BESE elements and 5 meter in length. And you don't see it right now, but inside of this, there are a lot of oyster shells. And what we did, this is the gravity-based foundation. So under here, there's just a big block of metal that's heavy enough to keep it in place. The bead elements themselves don't float, they will sink down anyways. But if you work in dynamic conditions, you still want to have additional base to it to keep it in place. And you see that with screws through the beads, we anchor them to the base. So we have these screws there and enough holes within the beads that you can indeed put something through and screw it on the top, and that you have something on the bottom to fasten it with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Philomena. I have a few questions. Can I ask? The mats, the BESE mats, what is the thickness of each one?
Yeah, the base thickness of one mat is, I'll show you this picture. So the base thickness is 2 centimeters. That's one single sheet. You see it like here, you see the clicking. Do you see my mouse actually?
Yes.
Yes.
Here you see the clicking areas. So one
Okay.
layer this is one layer, and then you click another layer on top of it by using these clicking points, and then you can create as high as you want, as what the system allows. For like seagrass, Botania restoration, we only need 3 layers, but for oyster reef restoration or creating this subtidal reef, you want to create a lot of substrate area. That's the goal of the material then. So then you just gonna layer it up, what the system allows you to do. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And is there flexibility in the mats? And if we were to put it on a substrate that has some riprap on it, would the mats conform to the rocks at all? Or is it more rigid?
Yeah, in the beginning they would stay flexible. So when you receive the material, it feels flexible, but the more layers you're gonna click on top of each other, the more rigid it gets. And also in the biodegradation process, the first ability it loses is its flexibility. So it's gonna get more brittle over the time you have it in the water. So indeed, if you want to place it or curl it around rocks, yeah, I would expect that in half a year the bees would break, just because they are not able to flex around material. The best way to put flat.
So potentially it could be good for just initial establishment of plants the first year. And then once the plants take root, then the bees mat would be sacrificed,
Exactly.
basically. Yeah, okay. And then in the Spartina plantings that you did, how did you secure the baby plants to the mats initially? Do they just kind of squeeze in?
We have done this in, because we are trialing for a long time right now. We have done it in a lot of different ways. And in this case, you actually see 2 bee sheets next to each other. So a normal bee sheet is half a square meter in surface area. And this is placing 2 next to each other to create 1 square meter of surface area. And then we made a hole in the middle where we just placed a tussock of Spartina. But this was for research goals mainly. So the labor intensity that didn't really matter, but now we are scaling up this method, and we are using actually different ways of doing this. I can actually show you in a short movie. I think this should be as well. Yeah. You should see movie screen now.
Not quite yet.
Yeah, so in this way, you see that we actually place really small seedling. I don't know what the English name is for small cluster. Sorry, my English is okay, but sometimes I miss some words in my vocabulary. But we place them within the BESE elements, just on its side, and then we click a layer on top of it. So we don't drill any holes in the BESE element, we don't do anything, and this is actually our growing facility, where we grow them until they are, we have a lot of problems with grazing of geese and ducks that are really hampering vegetation growth in the first half year. So what we do here is actually grow them for half a year until they're grown enough to actually withstand grazing, and then we place them out in the field at sort of square meters of salt marsh or square meters of riverbank vegetation, whatever is needed. Yeah.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. The project you did where the oysters, you said they did well in sort of that middle zone. Where was that middle zone relative to the tide? Was it mid-tide, or was it a bit lower, a bit higher?
Site-based differences. I think in every site and every oyster species you are working with, it's going to be different. So that's always depending on where we work. We like, I think you working in the area you work with, you probably know the optimal zone for oysters to grow. And we always rely on that source of knowledge to put our materials in those areas. And if it's not sure which area is more preferred, we always use trial treatments in different aerial zones, because yeah, we don't know every system as much as the Netherlands we know, but yeah.
Great. Has your product been used in New York State? Yeah, as far as you know.
No.
Okay.
Not yet, I think. No.
Although Malenthe, your bags are being used by the Billion Oyster Project. Your not the products you featured today, but your mesh bags.
Yeah, the mesh bags we have
in New York Harbor.
Yeah, the $1 Billion Oyster Project we have been in contact with at the beginning, and they have indeed the mesh bags, but for the BESE elements there are no trials within the area of New York. No.
Right. Thank you.
Can I ask you a few very pragmatic questions, Malenthe? I hate to talk money, but could you give us a sense of basically how much your products cost, more or less? And also in terms of ordering, is it just sort of standard sizes, or do you work with our design and create something specially for us? And in terms of the dimensions of our oyster reef and the work we're doing with the Spartina grass, and also this trying to encourage the growth of our salt marsh. Is it just, are they stock sizes, or is it, made to order?
Yeah, we do both. Like the regular size I just told you was the 2 centimeters in height. You get it in a meter, about a meter in length, and half a meter in width. So that's the basic size. And then if for transportation, it reduces a lot of cost if we do not click it for you, but that you click it yourself. Because of course, if you click it, the aerial extent of the BESE is going to be a lot larger. So we always supply single sheets, and then you can click them yourselves. And pre-made holes or anything you have designed in your project, we are happy to make. We do that for other projects as well. So that's definitely a possibility. About pricing, one BESE sheet with the dimensions I told is €7. So that's half a square meter for €7. And if you're going to use it for oyster reef restoration, it just depends on the way you're going to do it. How many layers you use, the price per half a square meter, of course. The higher you go, the more expensive it gets, of course. And we transport the material right now. We have a stock in Florida. So that saves a lot of transport costs for you guys, because normally we transport it from the Netherlands, and that's of course a lot higher than if we would ship it from within USA. So yeah, that should be okay. Yeah.
And I just had another quick question. You had talked about the calcium carbonate paste that you make.
Yeah.
And that it's used with a bigger restoration project where you don't have many volunteers to make it quicker to create the structure. Is there a preferred way using, we have a lot of volunteers, to use the oyster shells themselves versus the calcium carbonate paste?
Well, we like the paste indeed works really well to cover surface area for ourselves. But what we've noticed as well is that volunteers actually like to use it. So for now, we actually have our first project. It's just a trial in the Netherlands, that we have a school program in the Netherlands where we make tiny reefs with the reef paste, where we actually create a small pile of reef paste, stick some oyster shells in there, or let kids do that, and then let them harden it out, and then they can place that pile within the estuary we are working in. So that's like reef based, really volunteering based and educational based. And for larger projects, we just use them then ourselves to just paint these elements with it. Yeah, but you can also use it in a. We have had a lot of fun with it. Yeah.
That's a great volunteer activity. Really fun, engaging
Yeah,
people
it's
doing something like that.
yeah. I can. We have like this DIY box. What I can do is just send you one as a sample. You can just see what we do with it. It's like a fun educational box with make your own tiny reef. Yeah,
That'd be,
that we use in the Netherlands right now. Yeah,
we'd really appreciate that.
yeah.
Any other questions, or is that about it? I guess so. Malenthe, thank you very much for your time and all your information, and for staying up so late. What time is it there? Is it
11 o'clock in the evening.
so it's time to go to bed. Thank you very much for doing this so late and so after work for you.
Yeah, no worries. I'm just gonna take this hour tomorrow morning as a sleep.
Oh,
late
good. I'm glad.
morning, so I'm fine.
We really appreciate it, and it's great. It's such a pleasure, like making the connection with you and BESE right from the start. You were so welcoming and giving us a lot of information that we can use here. It's exciting work that you're doing.
Yeah, well, it's fun to connect with all these people around the world that are doing this restoration work. And like, yeah, please, if you have any questions to all of you, feel really free to reach out to us. We are always happy to help out in any way. Yeah, we can. So
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
yeah, good. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell my story.
You are so welcome. It's our pleasure. And good night.
Thank you. Yeah, good evening to you all.
Good night.
Bye.